Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and we have a discussion of disease this week. Now, I got to say, right? You a couple of weeks ago, you said I want to do a Jefferson show on smallpox. I went, what? Yeah, and then I got into it, and we started. It was a great idea. I congratulate you and thank you. It was a real fun conversation on a grim subject.
Well, first of all, it's inherently interesting. So here's Jefferson. I mean, if he had done nothing else in his life, as an advocate for the vaccine, as a believer in inoculation, as somebody who wanted to address epidemiology, he's a hero. He sent the serum up with Lewis and Clark. If it had stayed active, it went inert. If it had stayed active, it might have changed the course of history, although you wonder what leaders of the tribes would have thought when Jefferson...
I have trouble thinking that...
They would have done it.
Do what? For what?
Yeah, exactly.
Although there was some knowledge of the disease.
They understood it. But beyond that, as you know, we're living through this moment where this has gotten a lot of press, that there are significant numbers of Americans who don't want their children vaccinated for whatever reason.
Do you think it's significant numbers, or it's something that the press has paid a lot of attention to? I have no idea.
Well, I think that it's somewhere in between. So smallpox is gone now, but what if 5% of the people refused to get the vaccine and suddenly you had an outbreak of smallpox in Detroit or Los Angeles? Then what? Now what? What do you do? This is the problem, because we have individual liberty, but we also have community responsibility. But many people who want to exercise that individual liberty rightly say, hey, what's liberty if I can't make this choice?
Back to Jefferson, it's pretty obvious from his discussion this week, our discussion with him this week, that he was a real proponent of vaccination.
And you know why? Because he lived when it was still a scourge. The point is that I agree with you that there's no point in being doctrinaire about this on either side. But we're fortunate because you know that there's almost no chance that for the remainder of your life, whether it's 5 years or 50, that
I won't get polio.
You're not going to get those diseases.
I'm not going to get smallpox.
And
why? I'd be knocking on wood.
Why?
Because of vaccination.
Because of public health vaccination that has occurred. So, and you also know, because you're a fair-minded person.
Thank you.
That there's a chance that somebody might get an adverse reaction to a polio shot, or somebody might die of a serum. That, in other words, it's not 100%. There are medical mistakes. Some people's chemistry can't take certain things. We also know that pharmaceutical companies are by no means wholly innocent in these stories. And, you know, the opioid crisis is an example of how we've over-medicated because it's profitable. And, you know, the whole relationship between pharmaceutical reps and doctors, and then what doctors recommend, it's a huge and controversial area.
That just reminded me. I've got a nephew from Iowa going to university in Madison, Wisconsin.
One of the great universities.
Yes, and he was asleep 2 o'clock in the morning. Got a call from a friend who said, I'm in no shape to drive home. Will you come get me? And he did. Wintry, cold, slippery night, half awake, fell, broke his ankle.
No.
13 pins, a rod. He won't be completely healed until almost the end of the year.
The Florence Nightingale of the story got hurt.
Yes, and the opioids made me think of it, because they were trying to find some. It's one of the most painful injuries. So that's
once you get
it doesn't matter to anybody but me.
When you get a titanium
his
rod,
name
you're
is
in trouble.
Dawson, we're thinking about you.
Well, so look, we get it that this is not a black and white question. But I wanted to put this in a historical context, and there are two pieces of history that I think are important here. One is that Jefferson understood what was at stake, and he was a fierce advocate for vaccination and immunization of any sort. And secondly, that then there was an urgency to vaccination that maybe we've forgotten a little bit about, because we live in a time when most of these diseases have been largely overcome. So we have the luxury of now looking on almost like a case-by-case basis of what can go wrong or who has an adverse reaction.
Yeah, we're not overwhelmed by it anymore.
Because if there were, you remember when like the Ebola crisis, and like within everyone's like cover of Time, cover of Newsweek, cover of the New York Times, like, help us, stop this, prevent this. But the government's like, we're working on it. But people were demanding that government get involved. And so we have the luxury today of being able to be more nuanced about the vaccination regimens that we have, because we have largely overcome these diseases that were unbelievably potent in the time of Jefferson and before. That's my point. And so we need to keep that in mind as we have this debate.
A good point. We should all be grateful now. We need to go to the show. We're running
But
long.
don't you have to do your...
Well, if you would let me.
I'm trying.
We need to get to the show, but before we do, I just want to, a couple of things. I want to let people know that the new dates for next year's or the next round of cultural tours are up.
On the website, jeffersonhour.com.
Go to jeffersonhour.com and you can find those out. And you can also go there and ask President Jefferson a question, make a comment on the show, make a suggestion. We really appreciate that. And you can support the show there, too. You can either donate to the show or you can join the 1776 Club. That's all I'll say about that. And also a show alert. Next week, we are going to be talking about the Constitution Today. And
Akil Amar's book.
Right. That's one of the Jefferson Hour book clubs. So if you have questions about that, you better get them in quick.
Can I just say this? So I've been authorized by Monticello. I'm leading a Monticello group on the Lewis and Clark Trail this summer, beginning July 20th. And they have authorized me to allow a few Jefferson Hour listeners to come on that trip if they want to.
Nice.
So they just need to contact us at the tours, and they're just a handful of places, but they've said, would you like to bring a few of your particular Jefferson lovers on our tour? This is the Wendover Death March and the canoeing.
That's great.
So if people are interested, they can contact me through the site, or they can go to the site and contact our tour people. But so that's a possibility. But if you want to be part of that, now is the time. It's July 20th through 29th. So let's listen to the program. Send gifts. I love the gifts. More. David, and I hope your nephew Dawson does well.
I hope so, too.
And he soon recovers, and what a nice young man to go out in the middle of the night to help a friend.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me now is President Thomas Jefferson. Good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, I've chosen a topic for our conversation this week, sort of a grim subject, that of smallpox, sir.
Oh, my. Well, smallpox was still a serious international epidemic in my time. Nobody knows how many people it has carried off in the course of its long history, but tens of millions, certainly. It's incalculable.
I can tell you, sir, that it's estimated to have killed up to 300 million people during the 20th century.
Well, that would be long after my time. I'm surprised to hear that because, as you know, around 1801, when I was beginning my 2 terms as president, the great vaccine was discovered in Great Britain. And I thought that once that vaccine was widely accepted by the peoples of the world, that it wouldn't be that long before smallpox was extirpated once and for all.
Well, I live in a time, sir, when nearly everyone, was given a vaccination against smallpox.
I congratulate you, sir. I hope that that's not mandatory, but I hope that it is very encouraged.
Well, it's certainly a disease that no one wants to suffer, sir.
Well, I saw this. There wasn't a great deal of smallpox at Monticello. But when the war came, some of my slaves were taken off by the British when Bannister Tarleton raided Monticello and several others of my plantations in Cornwallis. They carried off slaves. They pretended that they were going to offer them freedom. And in fact, the colonial governor and the British Crown explicitly said that those slaves that rebelled, that ran away to the British, would be manumitted. That did not happen. Of my slaves that went off, several dozen of them, maybe as many as 35 or 6, a large number of them died of infectious diseases, including smallpox. So Monticello is more healthful. We were very careful there about preventing the spread of disease. But these slaves who went off to the British ships, which are horrible, they concentrate disease, they concentrate filth, they concentrate whatever is the contagion. They went off to these claustrophobic ships and British camps, and smallpox raged through them. As you probably know, our own great general, Washington, had his troops inoculated. It was a very dangerous thing in the time and quite controversial, but when he saw how many of his soldiers were being carried away by smallpox, he decided that he was going to institute mandatory inoculation, and did, and had a very high success rate with it because of that.
Yes, I was aware of that it was in 1777. By the year's end, nearly 40,000 soldiers had been immunized, and according to records kept, the infection rate fell from 17% to 1%.
Yes, so let me quickly explain how this worked. There are two types of human remedy to smallpox. One of them is vaccination, and we can come back to that later. That began in the last years of the 18th century and came to my attention around 1801. But before that, the procedure was known as inoculation. Inoculation, and I myself was inoculated, inoculation is a long, difficult, dangerous, and tedious business. And what was done essentially was that the recipient was actually given a dose of smallpox under carefully controlled circumstances, and the smallest possible dose, in the hopes that their own immune system would defeat it, that they would get smallpox, but in a minor sense, and that their own immune system would overcome it.
That's just hard for me, and I suspect many contemporary citizens, to understand that you, sir, said you were inoculated, so you were infected with smallpox.
Yes.
And that certainly could have led to your death.
And did sometimes. But you see the rate, you quoted the statistic, it had been experimented with and largely perfected. The conditions were very careful in their protocols.
How could that? I can't. Pardon me, sir. I just have trouble understanding how anything could be considered careful under that situation. What did you do to ensure that you didn't get a full-blown case?
Well, you can't ensure that, but here's what happened to me, and I think this was very common. So I couldn't get this done in Virginia, so I actually went to Philadelphia to do it. This was 1766. I was born in 1743, so I was a very young man. And I believe in vaccines and medicine. And I particularly realized that inoculation, however dangerous it is preferable to the unlimited spread of this contagion. And so I made my first journey out of Virginia to Annapolis, and then on to Philadelphia, and there I was inoculated. Now, that's not something that happens in a single afternoon. This is a month-long, sometimes 6 weeks regimen where you go into quarantine. You go into a house that has been marked for quarantine, that no one can come and no one can go, and then you begin to fast. Your diet is severely limited so that there's nothing rich about it. It's not an absolute fast, but it's a practical fast. And then they bring in this little serum of actual smallpox taken from somebody who has it. And the doctor scratches you, just as is done in your own time. And then a very tiny amount of the serum is put into that wound, and everyone then hopes for the best. There's vomiting. You do forced vomiting.
Why would that be, sir?
The sense of it in the time was that the richer your diet, the more protein you were carrying, the more fat in your digestive system, the more likely it was to feed the smallpox. So you want to be in a severely restricted diet, and the puking was thought to help prevent the kind of chemical buildup in the digestive system that could help encourage the spread of the pox through the rest of your body.
I must ask you a personal question, sir. Did you become very ill? Were there times where you were in quarantine wondering if you had done the right thing?
I think everyone felt that at some level, because once that disease is in you, it could easily spread through the rest of your system. The sense was that the people who were carried off in smallpox epidemics were people who had already had a breakdown of some sense in their immune system. They weren't their nutrition wasn't quite right. They weren't in great health. For whatever reason, these diseases pick on the most vulnerable of our citizens. If you're very strong, you might just be able to overcome this infection. And so we all had to fear it. I did not get terribly sick, but it's a severe regimen. You can read, and I did, of course, but you can't come and go. You're constantly hungry, and you can't help but wonder if by taking a small dose of this most dreaded of all diseases, you might not become one of the handful, the 1% or the 10%, whatever it turns out to be, who get the full-on infection and are killed. Some people survive smallpox. Queen Elizabeth I had the pox when she was in early middle age, and she survived it, but she was disfigured from it. And there's no day in the course of my life in Philadelphia or London or Paris or even for that matter Williamsburg when I didn't see somebody whose face was permanently disfigured from having survived smallpox.
Mankind has always had diseases it feared. Was this something that was considered every day? Was it something that people were in fear of all the time?
Of course, not smallpox necessarily. Smallpox would come and go. It might move like a wave through the colonies in a certain time and then be gone for 10 or 15 or 20 years. But there were many others, measles and mumps and whooping cough. My daughter Lucy died as just a child from complications of whooping cough and also a throat and ear infection. So we worried about all of these things. Tuberculosis was a very significant international problem in our time. The yellow fever, I'll give you an example of fear and our ignorance. So yellow fever was much more common than smallpox in the colonies and in the States. In 1793, there was a yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia, and it was so severe that it carried off 1 in 6 Philadelphians. Almost 1 in 5 of all the people living in the city of Philadelphia was killed by the yellow fever epidemic of 1793.
I'm certain that these diseases, yellow fever, smallpox, and the others you mentioned, had an effect on society, on commerce, on travel.
Of course, people's houses were boarded up, signs put on their doors that the pest was inside, that there could be no coming and going. The people of Philadelphia were so bewildered that they didn't know what to do. They had no idea where the yellow fever came from. We now know that it came from mosquitoes in the swampy lands along the shoreline and the rivers, unknown then. And so people actually took their muskets out and shot into the air, just in desperation, trying to break up the miasma in the sky. Dr. Benjamin Rush, my very close friend, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was the hero of the epidemic, and he went to hundreds, even thousands of houses that were covered with this disease to try to help people to the extent that medicine in our time knew what to do about this. So fear, panic, terror, a cessation of commerce. The government had to leave and move to another place because we feared that the government of the United States would succumb to the disease.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jefferson. We need to take a short break. I do want to thank you, sir, for sharing all of your personal experiences. When we come back, I'd like to talk to you about a gentleman you knew and respected, a Dr. Jenner.
Oh, one of the great heroes of our time.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson between these segments of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, inviting you to be part of the Thomas Jefferson Hour Book Club. As you know, we are looking somewhat formally at a number of books this year. And the next on the list is Jefferson's only published book, Notes on the State of Virginia. It was an answer to a set of questionnaires, but Jefferson turned it into an American classic, kind of encyclopedia/almanac/love song to his Virginia, which extended at that time all the way from the Atlantic at least to the Rocky Mountains and maybe beyond. So Notes on the State of Virginia. You can join us by sending in your comments or your questions or your thoughts, but we need them by April 15th so that we can include them in the book club program on Notes on the State of Virginia. Go to our website, jeffersonhour.com, and you'll find all the details. But let us know what you think about Jefferson's only published book, the classic Notes on the State of Virginia. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week we're speaking with President Jefferson about the grim subject of smallpox. And we've talked a bit about the history of it, and you've shared some of your insights, sir.
I was inoculated in 1766. Many others in my time were inoculated, but there was widespread concern based on two reasons, really. The anti-inoculators, let's call them, had two essential arguments. One was that God might be exercising his judgment by carrying off portions of the population, and it wasn't for humans to interfere with God's designs for the world. How did we know what his intentions were? And for humans to try to step between God and these epidemics was a sign of sin and hubris. I don't take that argument very seriously, but it was held in some quarters in my time. The second argument was the one that you have alluded to, which was that many people felt, wait a minute, you're going to prevent this disease by introducing it to my body? And so many people felt revulsion to the idea that they would be deliberately given a dose of smallpox in the hopes of preventing a much more severe acquisition of it by way of contagion.
As I said, I'd like to talk to you a bit about Dr. Edward Jenner. Could you explain your relationship with him and what you learned from him?
Yes. So Jenner was British, and he was involved in the same problem, which was we all understood that if you give a person a small dose of smallpox and they survive it, then they are immune, that prevents it from ever returning. But everyone understood that this is an imperfect solution to this problem. And the question was, is there a better way to immunize somebody? Well, he noticed that this is such a great moment. This is pure Enlightenment science. You observe, and then you draw hypotheses, and then you test those hypotheses, and then you discover something that can benefit humankind. What he noticed was that milkmaids, so dairy cows were being milked in Britain by women, by young women, milkmaids, and he noticed that they frequently got a pox. It's called kindpox or cowpox, and that some of its superficial symptoms on the skin and so on are very similar to, if not identical to, those of smallpox. So there's kindpox and there's smallpox. But here's what he discovered, that these milkmaids who got kindpox never subsequently got smallpox. No one dies from kindpox. It's like getting the chickenpox or the measles. I mean, you can die, but it's very rare. So he discovered that kindpox, it's a cousin to smallpox, and once you have had it, you can never get smallpox. This is one of the greatest discoveries in the history of the world. And so then he thought, I will use the kindpox, not smallpox, not to inoculate people, but to vaccinate them. And as you probably know, the word vaccinate comes from the Roman Latin word vacus, which means cow. So vaccination is immunization by way of cowpox, vaccination, rather than inoculation, which is to render innocent or impotent the true smallpox. So this was one of the greatest moments in the history of the world. He tested this, and it proved to be efficacious. And then, like all good men of the Enlightenment, he didn't go out and patent his vaccine. He didn't try to capitalize on this and to keep it to himself to get a government grant or a monopoly to protect his idea from the rest of the world. He realized immediately that this idea belonged to humankind, that this idea was too important to profit from. And so he offered it freely to anyone who was interested in it. And some of that serum, the true vaccine serum from kindpox, came to me by way of a man named Benjamin Waterhouse from Harvard. And as soon as I got it, I had read the literature about it. As soon as I had some of the vaccine, I vaccinated some of my servants, and later more than 200 of the slaves at Monticello. And I became a propagandist for the vaccine and convinced anyone that I could that this was one of the great breakthroughs in the history of medicine.
You wrote to Dr. Jenner in May of 1806 saying, "Medicine has never before produced any single improvement of such utility." It's almost as if it was a fan letter.
It is a fan letter. It's one of the happiest.
Could you share some of that with us, sir?
Of course. This is May 14th, 1806, so this is a few years after I first had access to his vaccine serum. But I just decided to write him this fan letter. And here's why. A politician like Patrick Henry has done great things, or John Adams, or myself, Mr. Madison. I don't mean to downplay their achievements, but remember, in Swift's Gulliver's Travels, the narrator says, "He who makes two blades of grass grow where one did previously has done more good than all of the statesmen of history." So practical solutions to actual human problems are the most important contributions that we can make to the future of the world to ameliorate the condition of mankind. And so I wanted him to know how important that I thought his work was. So here's a bit from the letter of May 14th, 1806. "Medicine has never before produced any single improvement of such utility. You have erased from the calendar of human afflictions one of its greatest. Yours is the comfortable reflection that mankind can never forget that you have lived. Future nations will know by history only that the loathsome smallpox has existed and by you has been extirpated. Accept my fervent wishes for your health and happiness and assurances of the greatest respect and consideration." Think of that. You have erased from the calendar of human afflictions one of the greatest.
Well, I could tell you, sir, that the last recorded death of a person who suffered smallpox was in Great Britain in 1978, a young woman who had been inadvertently exposed due to some medical research.
But not out in the public. This had to do with the scientific laboratory.
So the disease publicly has pretty much been eradicated as far as my knowledge. And
I congratulate you.
I wish we could let this gentleman know somehow that his work succeeded in that.
Did you know that when I sent Meriwether Lewis up the Missouri River in 1804, I sent some vaccine with him?
I did not. I was going to ask you about that.
I sent a vial of the serum, and I said to him, when you reach tribes, because we knew that smallpox had penetrated deep into the continent on several previous waves, I said, when you reach these tribes, if they are willing, vaccinate and keep this serum alive. You have to, it's like sourdough starter. It will die unless you keep it alive. I said, vaccinate. If they're willing, vaccinate everybody or teach them how to vaccinate their own people. Unfortunately, by the time he reached any significant Indian population base in the upper Missouri, the serum had gone inert and you can't revive it. So he was unable to pursue this. But imagine if Mr. Lewis had been able to offer this vaccine to the Oto and the Missouri and the Omaha and the Teton Sioux and the Arikara and the Mandan and the Hidatsa and the Assiniboine and the Shoshone and the Crow and the Nez Perce and the Clatsop and the Chinooks and the Walla Walla. He met more than 50 different tribes. Imagine if Mr. Lewis had been able to be the Pied Piper of true vaccination, it would have saved millions of lives, certainly hundreds of thousands of lives in the American West. And if you think we were terrified by smallpox, imagine what it was to Indians, because we knew smallpox. It had been around from the beginning of time. There wasn't any Euro-American in the 18th century who wasn't aware of the scourge of smallpox. But now go to, say, the Arikara, who have lived for millennia on the upper Missouri and have never encountered such a thing, and suddenly some sort of a contagion comes to their tribe, and within days, a fifth of the people are dead, half of the people are dead, two-thirds of the people are dead. They have no idea where it came from. They have no science to speak of, and so their superstition tells them that this must be intended by the gods, or the Great Spirit wants to punish them for some wrongdoing. The terror of not knowing. It's one thing to know and to be frightened. It's much worse to not know and be overwhelmed by terror.
The tribes in my area suffered greatly, I think particularly of the Mandan Indians, who could easily have been wiped off the records of time. But I will tell you, sir, they survived and they exist
But,
today.
sir, when Lewis got to the Mandan in late October 1804, he learned that they had migrated from a set of villages at the Heart River, I believe, up to the Knife River, a distance of 80 or 90 miles, because in 1781 and 82 there had been a wave of smallpox, and that had killed off the great majority of the Mandan, to the point where they felt, as a national security measure, they needed to go up and live amongst the Hidatsa, their cousins. They were linguistic cousins, because they were frightened of the Sioux and wanted a larger population base. So Lewis sort of understood this and didn't always quite fully understand it, but he knew that some terrible epidemic had passed through. He assumed it was smallpox, and that it had created a collapse of Mandan population, not quite a collapse of culture, but a collapse of population, which had led them to this historic migration up to the Knife River. So, and he saw the same thing, by the way, among the Arikara villages at the top of what's now South Dakota. So he saw this, and here's what's so interesting about this. I mean, I say interesting, tragically interesting. The first smallpox that came to the Mandan may not have come from a white person. It may have come from another Indian who had contact with white people. So let's say that a person of the Teton Lakota had contact with somebody in Detroit. That could then follow the Native American, not a white person, back to those tribes.
Contemporary historians speculate that the disease was first introduced when the Spanish came and then moved up the Missouri and Mississippi valleys, and they estimate that 17,000 tribal people on the Missouri died from the disease.
It's so hard for us to absorb that kind of information without a sense of deep chagrin and sadness. I am glad, however, to be able to say that Lewis and Clark did not spread the disease, that Lewis and Clark were traveling with a party of 33. There was no infection of that sort among them, and that the smallpox epidemic had come through a generation before Lewis and Clark. They saw a refugee people, a remnant people, but they themselves were not spreading the smallpox or measles or mumps. I will say, in the interest of history, that they may have been spreading syphilis and gonorrhea.
These methods of preventing smallpox, inoculation, vaccination, they were not without controversy, and I'd like you to speak about that. But before we leave inoculation in the past, there's a friend of yours that had quite an experience being inoculated, and that would be John Adams. Do you know any details about that story, sir?
Well, I do, because, of course, Adams and I spent a great deal of time together. We were both advocates of inoculation and then later vaccination. Both of us were scientifically educated and understood that this was a really important thing to be inoculated, even if slightly dangerous. So he told me about his own circumstances. Also in the 1760s, his wedding had to be postponed because of a smallpox outbreak. in Boston, and he decided that he had better get himself inoculated. You can read about this in the letters between himself and Abigail Adams. He called her Portia. They were using kind of fancy literary names for their nascent romance. But his letters to Portia, to Abigail Adams about this are quite interesting, and he comes at it in a very manly way and is prepared to endure the 6 weeks of the quarantine, and he's puking and describing the quality of his vomit and how he feels and how he's really very hungry, but he's willing to do all this. He has a comic spirit that I don't have, and he took this all in great good stead and wrote long and now historically interesting letters to his wife Abigail about the process. And we know where there are many accounts of what people went through in this regimen, but his are amongst the richest and most humorous accounts of enduring the fairly long period. Imagine if you went to your doctor today and say you wanted a flu shot or a polio vaccine, and the doctor said, well, sir, you're going to have to take a 6-week sabbatical from your life, and you're going to have to be in a place where no one can come and no one can go, and whoever's going to be your food service providers has to be someone who's already had the disease and is going to agree to stay with you for that time. And then we're going to keep you there in darkness and with a minimalist diet and with forced vomitings and emetics for a month or 6 weeks, and you can't know when we start whether you will live through this or not.
Not an easy ordeal, and as I mentioned earlier, nor one without some controversy. There were riots in cities. It seems to me, sir, I read somewhere that you actually acted as a lawyer and defended some people involved in rioting. Do you recall this?
Yes, so we've explained how some people just found this to be appalling for different reasons. And so there was a group in Norfolk that was specializing in this. Most people were not inoculated in my time. Most people didn't have the access to it or the funds or the time, or most people didn't even consider this as a possibility or rejected it on moral grounds or on the grounds of the strangeness of taking a dose of a disease you're trying to prevent. But there were a couple of doctors, including Archibald Campbell down in Norfolk, who were in a very quiet way inoculating small groups of people, and a mob.
Well, the public was in great fear of this, right?
Of course, because if you think of, let's say, a public health official in Williamsburg hearing that on the edge of town or in Norfolk somebody is doing experiments with small doses of smallpox, which they have brought in from somewhere else, that's going to raise some eyebrows and some concerns. And so there wasn't a disease protocol regimen in our time. There wasn't a public health service in our time the way you have them in yours, and these things were not well understood either. So a mob eventually threw rocks and bricks and clubs through their windows and burned down his shop, his house.
You, sir, were a young man, 23, 24 years of age. This must have made an impression upon you.
It told me a couple of things. First of all, that you have to be willing to be a champion of unpopular ideas, that many of the best ideas in the world are initially unpopular, and there is enormous resistance to them, and you have to decide, am I going to succumb and just fall back into the group thinking, or am I going to have the courage of my convictions, particularly on a question like this of science, and I'm going to speak out? I then offered my services to defend the people whose lives had been damaged by this mob. I defended them in the court system of Virginia because I felt that there was a sort of a lynching mentality, and so but I also believe that we must educate the people so they understand these things, and their reactions are rational ones based on evidence and with a long view, not based on some sort of immediate visceral reaction. Whenever humans react in a kind of immediate and visceral way, we're descending back into our status as primates, and we're not taking advantage of the great gift of science and civilization.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to The Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson. In between these segments of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, let me invite you to next year's Winter Humanities Retreats at Lochsaw Lodge, just west of Missoula, Montana. The first is The Imagination of Charles Dickens, January 12th through 17th. And the second one is Exploring the Space Program, January 18th through 23rd. These are the book club you always wanted to be part of in a magnificent winter wonderland. It's not cold, but there is some snow. And we sit around a fire drinking eggnog and hot chocolate talking about some of the most interesting books and interesting ideas in American life. The first of them, Charles Dickens, January 12th through 17th, 2020, and Exploring the American Space Program, January 18th through 23rd. Go to the website jeffersonhour.com/tours for all the details. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and across from me is the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson.
Let me interject. It was a couple of weeks ago. You texted me and said, I want to do a Jefferson Hour about smallpox. I'm like, what? And you said, no, you have to look in. So I began to research it and look at all the known information about Jefferson and smallpox and the disease and the history of it. And it is a fascinating subject, a bit dark, but fascinating.
But, we live in this time when those diseases have largely been eradicated. And if you read Harari's book, Homo Deus, he says that epidemics, plagues, have been one of the 3 or 4 central factors of human existence from the beginning of time. And now, in the 21st century, in the first world at least, we are within sight of overcoming all of them, that the things that have carried off significant percentages of the human population have now been eradicated through human science. And you think, wow.
I think you might get some pushback on that. We don't know what's yet to come, and we know that there are mutations happening, and
of course,
things like so. It's not like we're scot-free and clear here.
But Harari thinks that we've now reached a point where there will never be a significant plague that we can't contain quickly through science. Now, think of what he's up against, because now, thanks to air traffic, the mobility of people is astonishing. So if somebody has the plague, or somebody has smallpox, or somebody has polio or tuberculosis and gets on a Boeing 767 in Cairo or London, that can spread to every person in that plane before they land, and then they, carrying it, could spread it to everyone they meet. There's a Stephen King novel about this. But you see the point that epidemics ran their course locally in the age of Jefferson. This was the first stage of serious global communication, but it was still minuscule. Today, something you can get from Beijing to Boston or Bismarck within 24 hours.
One of the things I enjoyed talking to President Jefferson about this week was the notion of fear in the public. And there were people who were very opposed to any kind of inoculation. And there were people who, like Jefferson and Adams, were brave enough to do it and say, okay, either way is a gamble, but I gamble this way. I thought that was pretty interesting.
And that Washington
had
his troops inoculated.
I wish we would have talked to Peter Stark about that. I'm certain he knew.
But see, these were brave leaders who knew that the culture would benefit from this.
Armies were wiped out. The northern forces were just about wiped out from smallpox.
Disease carried away more soldiers in the Napoleonic Wars and in the American Revolution than all the musket bullets that ever existed. And disease, one hates to say it, but disease did more to conquer Native Americans between 1775 and Wounded Knee than all of the armies that ever marched into the field. You can't read the story of the Native Americans' inability to overcome these pathogens which they had never had any cultural or genetic background with, and not just feel heartbroken. It is what it is. There are people who believe that germ warfare was being deliberately used and blankets were infected with smallpox and spread around. That's almost certainly not true. But even inadvertently and by accident, Euro-Americans were spreading these diseases for which there was no immune capacity to resist amongst native peoples.
There is interesting writing in the Lewis and Clark journals about this and them noting it. But there was a couple of people we didn't talk about.
Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather is a Puritan divine in New England. Prolific, wrote, several hundred books.
400 publications.
Shorter than our books, but still, that's a lot of publication. Famous Reverend. He's one of the significant figures in the history of American religion and Puritanism. And he learned from a slave that smallpox could be addressed by inoculation. And there had been inoculations in Africa and in Asia for centuries. And one of the slaves that wound up owned by Cotton Mather told him, hey, there's this thing you can do. And Mather said, this is a very smart slave. And he then appropriated this remedy and began to use it. So as early as the mid-18th century up in Boston, inoculation was beginning to have a role in response to smallpox in the United States.
And a sidebar, when
but it's not altogether admirable.
But I just thought this was pretty interesting. He, as we said, he had 400 publications, one of which was titled Memorable Providences Relating to Witchcrafts and Possessions. It was published in 1698 and considered a best-selling book, was the subject of much discussion throughout Puritan New England, and it dealt with an Irish washerwoman and her children. She was named Goody Glover. Long story short, she was eventually executed for witchcraft, and he played a major role in that.
There's no American of our moment here, David, who hasn't heard the term witch hunt recently. It all goes back to the actual phenomenon of witch hunting, which occurred in Great Britain, and had a virulent outbreak in New England and led Arthur Miller to write his famous play, The Crucible, and so on. But there was witch hunting. The witches were ducked. They were burned. They were tortured. Mostly these were older women who lived alone and had kind of scary lives, like the person who lives on the edge of town in the old house. But there's a dark side to Puritanism. There's a very dark side to Puritanism, and this was part of it.
It's about time, sir, to go to your essay for this week.
But before I do, can I do one thing?
Certainly.
Well, first of all, I want to quote back that letter. One of all my favorite Jefferson letters, the letter to Edward Jenner on May 14th, 1806,
That's great.
Is right up at the top.
That's great.
Who would not want to receive this letter?
He even called it a fan letter.
Yours is the comfortable reflection that mankind can never forget that you have lived. Oh, boy, that'll never be said of us. But let me quote from, this will break your heart, but this is Forebear's speech. You know this one. July 30th, 1837, he was a great friend to white people, one of the greatest leaders of the Mandan in that era. When the 1837 smallpox epidemic roared through the Mandan world and killed almost everybody, he was infected too, and he was seeing people in his family commit suicide. They were so disfigured and in such pain, and he gave this speech. I'll just give you a bit of it. My friends, one and all, listen to what I have to say. Ever since I can remember, I have loved the whites. I have lived with them ever since I was a boy, and to the best of my knowledge, I have never wronged a white man. On the contrary, I have always protected them from the insults of others, which they cannot deny. The forebears never saw a white man hungry but what he gave him to eat, drink, and a buffalo skin to sleep on in time of need. I was always ready to die for them, which they cannot deny. I have done everything that a red skin could do for them, and how they have repaid it with ingratitude. I have never called a white man a dog, but today I do pronounce them to be a set of black-hearted dogs. They have deceived us. Them that I always considered as brothers has turned out to be my worst enemies. I have been in many battles, often wounded, but the wounds of my enemies I exult in. But this day I am wounded, and by whom? By these same white dogs that I have always considered and trusted as brothers. I do not fear death, my friends, you know it, but to die with my face rotten, that even the wolves will shrink with horror from seeing me and say to themselves, that is the forebears, the friend of the whites. Listen well what I have to say, as it will be the last time you will hear me. Think of your wives, children, brothers, sisters, friends, and in fact all that you hold dear are all dead or dying with their faces all rotten, caused by these dogs the whites. Think of all that, my friends, and rise all together and not leave one of them alive. the forebears will act his part. Heartbreaking. Heartbreaking.
And now, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
To vaccinate or not to vaccinate? Ask the Mandan Indians. The great French essayist Montaigne, whose dates are 1533 to 1592, wrote about everything. He's one of the inventors of the essay as a genre, though there are roots as far back as Plutarch and Seneca in the ancient world. Montaigne used the word essays to mean something like informed trial balloons, and he frequently ended some passage or assertion in his essays by saying, "Que sais-je? What do I know?" That's the kind of modesty and skepticism that Jefferson admired. To Edmund Randolph, Jefferson wrote, "I think it is Montaigne who has said that ignorance is the softest pillow on which a man can rest his head. I am sure it is true as to everything political, and shall endeavor to estrange myself to everything of that character." So let me begin and end this little essay on vaccination by saying, "Que sais-je? What do I know?" My mother had a mild case of polio when she was in her late teenage years. At the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the most famous polio victim in the world. My mother suffered no debilitation from her bout of polio, so far as we know. Polio is very nearly eradicated once and for all, thanks to Enlightenment science, and in part to Rotary International, a wholly good organization, in spite of the jocular fines, the occupational badges, decades of refusing to admit women, and occasional babbitry. I think it was H.L. Mencken who said the first Rotarian was the first person ever to call Jesus Jack. Polio is proving more difficult to eradicate than smallpox, in part because there is, it's only fair to report, a vaccine-induced strain of it that science has not yet found a way to prevent. But in the United States, at least, polio is virtually non-existent. Thanks to Jonas Salk's invention of the vaccine in 1955, the year of my birth, not in time for my mother, or in time for one of the 2 or 3 greatest presidents in American history. Smallpox has been one of the greatest scourges of humankind. It's estimated that the disease killed more than 2 billion people before we finally started to get it under control in the 18th century, first by inoculation and later by true vaccination, pioneered by the British physician Edward Jenner. Smallpox vaccination has been so profoundly effective that 25 years ago there was actually a debate in epidemiological circles about whether to snuff the stuff out forever or keep a tiny bit of it alive in a tightly sealed and controlled container, just in case, for some reason we do not now understand, we need to study it down the road. Think of that. A serious debate about whether to exterminate it once and for all, or to preserve it because someday, in some way, it may turn out to be important to our understanding of the nature of contagion. On the surface, vaccination would seem to be a no-brainer, that no rational being could possibly resist medical breakthroughs that have saved millions, perhaps billions of people from disease, pain, disfiguration, shortened lives, and death. If you told Thomas Jefferson that there were chemical substances that could prevent or cure the diseases that have plagued humankind for millennia, from yellow fever, the 1793 outbreak in Philadelphia killed 1 in 6, to measles, from mumps, tuberculosis, chickenpox, whooping cough, which killed his daughter Lucy in 1784, all the way to smallpox, he would rejoice and bow in reverence to the majesty of science. If you told him that a significant minority of Americans chose to refuse to have their children vaccinated for several different reasons, he would shake his head in sadness and quote from his letter to Charles Clay in 1790, "The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, and we must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time, and eternally press forward for what is not yet there. It takes time to persuade men to do even what is for their own good." A number of infectious diseases are making a comeback thanks to vaccine refusers, among them true plague, mumps, measles, tuberculosis, chickenpox, and scarlet fever. I know some of the vaccine detractors. Perhaps you do too. They are firm, even fierce in their insistence that vaccines can lead to unintended side effects, including, they allege, autism, that the big pharmaceutical corporations are running a very profitable scam in persuading doctors to force vaccines into our bodies, including flu shots, and that if American liberty means anything, it means that parents have the right to decline having their children vaccinated. If we are not free to raise our children as we wish, what good is liberty? Some parents refuse to have their daughters receive the HPV vaccine, which prevents cervical cancer, because they say that it encourages promiscuity and premarital sex. I lived in a rural village in Kansas that refused to give young people access to condoms on the same principle. 5 students of the graduating class were pregnant. Apparently, they just didn't say no. I have no doubt that the big pharmaceutical companies engage in appalling profiteering and that their first purpose is not the health of the people of the world. I am sure in some cases things go wrong with vaccines. I believe in liberty. But I hope that the number of vaccine refusers remains small so that we can prevent the spread of these dread diseases in spite of their, to my mind, irrational preference for liberty over public health. I disagree with what they do, but I will defend to the death their right to do it, and it may be death, if you think about it. Just ask the Mandan Indians in my home state of North Dakota, once a proud and mighty Earth Lodge people living in between 9 and perhaps 13 well-zoned municipalities at the mouth of the Heart River at today's Bismarck. They had a population of maybe 22,000 at the time of first contact with white Europeans. By the time Lewis and Clark arrived in 1804, they had been reduced by the first of 2 massive smallpox epidemics from being one of the most puissant tribes of the upper Missouri to a semi-refugee people who had moved upriver to seek protection and more community from their cousins, the Hidatsa. When Lewis and Clark arrived, they had a population of approximately 1,250, about 6% of their former numbers. And then in 1837, a trade boat operated by the American Fur Company knowingly but not deliberately brought a new smallpox outbreak to the Mandans. By the time that epidemic had run its course, there were fewer than 145 Mandans left on Earth. At Jefferson's instigation, Lewis and Clark actually carried a vial of the vaccine with them on their journey to the Pacific. Unfortunately, the culture had become inert before they could vaccinate a single Native American. I regard Jefferson as a hero in the history of epidemiology. Okay, let's assume that a teeny-eeny handful of vaccine recipients have significant negative reactions to vaccines. Let's agree without debate that Big Pharma, as they like to call it, is greedy and unscrupulous. Let's even honor the spirit of liberty in the refuseniks. With Montaigne, I say, que sais-je? But the simple fact is that a few doubters have the luxury of being openly skeptical about vaccines in the 21st century, precisely because we have gotten on top of most of the catastrophic infectious diseases since the scientific revolution of the 17th century and the Enlightenment that began shortly thereafter. If smallpox were still killing off 80 to 94% of our towns and cities every 20 years or so, you can bet that those same people would be crying loudly for scientific and even government intervention. Just ask the Mandan. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.